Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Sloan the Record, recording and publishing on March 18th, 2025. My name is Nathan Sloan, and joining me as usual is my father Ron. Each week we're going on the record about family history, and along the way we'll see if we can't learn more of the people, traditions, values, and stories that made us, all while opening a window for everyone else to see a slice of life in rural North Carolina. New episodes are usually published on Sundays, and we appreciate every listener. You can make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or the Podbean app. Hey, Dad, thanks for joining me again as we go back into the 1980s. Are you doing well today?
Yeah, doing good.
So I say usually on Sundays because we didn't publish on this past Sunday, so we're trying to squeak an episode out, and that's totally my fault. It's because baby Ronan, is really taking it out of me these last 4 or 5 days. So, and Emily as well. So we're hanging in there, still hoping to have Emily come in and do an episode, but she's not going to be ready to do that for a little while. So we're just going to have to hang on and wait until she and I get to a period where we can wrap our minds around what that episode might look like. But while we're on that topic of baby and shortened episodes and release schedules being all over, with this episode, we got this episode and then 3 more to do. And then we will go on somewhat indefinite hiatus, hopefully until baby is sleeping through the night, and we'll come back whenever that is. I think the plan is for it to be at least 2 months. But I do want to get through these last 4 episodes. That being said, I can't guarantee that they're going to be up to the same level that the previous episodes were, but we'll do the best that we can. Last week, I thought we could get through the entirety of the 1980s and the story of all us kids being born in one episode, and that just didn't work out, so it's too much to cover. So I've got a few more questions from that topic, and we're going to cover those today. I also wanted to note that in last week's episode, you mentioned, Dad, that Mom had a premonition about Elizabeth's birth having something to do with a 7 before her eventual birth on December 7th, but I don't think you mentioned that she was born on the 7th, weighing 7 pounds, 7 ounces. So one of several instances like that where Mom had some interesting coincidences or intuition, I guess we'll call it. And maybe we'll be able to cover some more of those instances in a future episode, but I just thought that detail was worth mentioning before we moved on. So, question number 1. What did your parents and Mom's parents think about you guys having children in the late 70s, early 80s? What did they think of the grandkids?
Oh, they were thrilled about it. Mom was always about being a mom, and my mother, it was a happy time for her, and the first grandchildren for Susan's mom and dad, and so they were very excited too. So it was a really positive thing from that standpoint. My mother came over several days after we got home and stayed with Susan and just helped out with things around the house. When I had to go back to work. So she came over from Lillington, and I think that's really where she and Susan bonded, and Susan's relationship with her became so special, was during that time of, having that experienced hand there and that company during that time.
And then I believe on the other side of the family, on Mom's side of the family, Elizabeth would have been the first grandchild. Is that right? Do you have any memories of what it was like for them to be grandparents for the first time?
Yeah, they loved it. Her mom was just really enjoyed the little girl, and being right across the street, she could come over and see her. She was working at that time, but she would come over after work and come over on the weekends. And she'd a lot of times take Elizabeth and get in the swing and the porch swing when the weather permitted. And Elizabeth loved, and always has and still does love swinging. I've often wondered how much of it was attributed to Grandma swinging her and how much was attributed to that little, she called it the tick-tock. It was a little swing stand with a baby seat in it, and you wind it up, and it would go like a clock pendulum, and it would swing the child. And she loved that little thing, too. But her Grandma was always, her little special thing was at Easter, she always got clothes for the grandkids to wear at Easter. But it was really special to her, and Granddaddy Bill, he loved it too. He loved coming over and feeding Elizabeth ice cream when she was tiny. And she would get excited and do her little fingers, her hands out, and kind of rock while she was waiting. He called her his little bird because of her, when she got excited, she'd move those little fingers. And he loved to feed her ice cream. And then you recall, I'm sure, your relationship with him and how much he enjoyed you, and picking you up from preschool and keeping you afternoons riding on the back of his little scooter down to Roy Dunn's and getting you used.
Those are good memories for sure.
Yeah. So it was a very pleasant experience. People used to kind of, when they'd find out where I lived and where my in-laws lived, they kind of joked with me about, like, what, right across the street. But they were always a blessing to us, and never had anything but support and good things with them being there that close to us. It was really a good thing. Granddaddy loved going and picking the children up after school, and he loved bringing them treats. And it gave him something to do, to look forward to after he was retired. And so it was good times. It was really, really a sweet experience. I'm thankful for it.
In 2008, you became a grandparent for the first time. And I was there. I remember it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was very bizarre for me because I'd always known you as dad. To see you go into doting grandfather mode, I was just sort of like, wow, this is just a different side of my dad that I've never seen before with Ryan. And that continued, of course, with your other grandchildren as they came along. I'm wondering, after becoming a grandparent, did that cause you to look at some of the behaviors or desires or any of that period of time with your children a little bit differently when you understood maybe a bit more about what your parents and what mom's parents were feeling when they became grandparents?
Okay, I'm trying to make sure I understand what you're saying. That you're wondering how.
Basically, when I became a parent, you were like, do you look at how your parents did things differently now that you're a parent? All right. I haven't had a lot of experience being a parent, so my answer to that question was kind of like, well, not yet. But I'm wondering if you now empathize a little bit more with grandparents' desire to be around the grandkids, or just what that felt like for them to become grandparents, because I think we have an idea in our head, but you just can't know what it's like until it happens.
No, that's true. And, going into it, I had people saying things to me that I was just like, well, that's kind of dumb. They were saying, oh, you had never loved anything the way you're going to love those grandchildren, and my thought and reaction to that was pretty much, I couldn't possibly love somebody else's children the way I love my children. I don't understand why they think, all these people are saying this at you. And so I kind of went into it with maybe a jilted view, a little bit belligerent to that thought of loving. But I remember when Elizabeth, after a long labor, ended up like Emily with a C-section. And we stayed there in the room where the room where she was in labor. We stayed there while she was in surgery, and Craig was back with her. And Craig, after a while, came in rolling this little cart, and he said, "Meet your grandson." And I walked over, Susan and I did, to that little cart and looked down, and it was incredible. I felt this love for this child, it was instantaneous. And, it was really, funny how it hits you, and I guess gave me a better understanding of what people were saying and what other grandparents felt, and probably what my grandparents felt. It's I don't know. I think in a lot of things we wish we could relive favorite times in our lives and experiences. You know, when you get to my age, you look back at these things that just seem to go too fast, just seem to go by in a blur. And, you know, you do your best to recall all these special things, but a lot of them just get lost in the cracks of your mind. And you know, it's hard to remember everything. It's one of the reasons I told you to do a journal, you know, of these little things, special moments and special feelings you had and times, because otherwise you think you'll never forget these things, but you do. And and I remember, you know, that I remember as we were leaving the hospital that day, I turned around to Susan and I said, you know, it's the strangest thing. I've known that little guy for less than 4 hours, but I would die for him. I would just, you know, you do love him. I think part of it goes back to what I was saying, that you realize that it feels like something else that you've experienced that was wonderful, that you'd almost forgotten what it felt like to feel, you know, this new child come into the world and know that that's a little bit of you that's there, and to be able to see that and feel that, and to be able to anticipate these other things that you loved, like, you know, here's another little boy and thinking about helping him ride a bicycle and helping him catch a fish and all the playing with him the way I played with my son. I still remember holding you up, laying on my back and holding you up, and you'd want to fly like a bird. And you would go tweet, tweet, but you would flap your arms as I held you by the waist. And one day you were too big. You know, it just seemed like it happened. Once was the last time, you know, and I think there's so many of those last times, picking you up and running with you to the railroad track to see the trains go by. And then one day was the last time I could do that. If I'd have known when it was, it probably broke my heart, you know, but then here was another chance to see the thrill in a child's eyes, seeing a train, you know, come by. And so it's kind of a do-over, you know, a chance to go back and experience some of your favorite things again. And that's
so speaking of that, that's a perfect segue. You've already talked a little bit about how you hope to make some memories with Ronan.
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm putting you on the spot, and you maybe aren't going to have the perfect answer, but we just want to get something. What's a special memory, real quick, special memory that you have with Ryan, Amelia, Jacob? Go.
Well, one that comes immediately with Ryan was of him coming up to me and saying, he called me Guy. That was the name he came up with. Guy Twain. You know, he would say there was a train coming. He could hear him and notice him before I would, and he'd want me to grab him up and run with him to do that. Probably one of the most favorite things with him was one Christmas I had been wanting to take him to see Santa Claus, and the Santa Claus I wanted to take him to had just gotten booked up to where there weren't any more public events he was coming to. And his wife called me and said, can you have your grandson at your house at 6 o'clock tomorrow? And I said, yeah, I think so. And she said, well, Santa Claus said he would come by your house. And so I set up one of those old Victorian chairs in the living room, and Elizabeth brought him over, and of course he went to me immediately. And I told him Elizabeth was still holding him. He was leaning out towards me, and I said, somebody really special's come to see you. And I pointed in the living room, and he turned, and Santa Claus was sitting there in that Victorian chair. And Elizabeth had already said, and Susan had said, you got to be prepared. He may be scared of him, may cry, may run from him, you know. And here you are going to all this trouble with this man to come. But he saw Santa Claus, and he almost fell out of his mother's arms. He just dived forward, and she got him down to the floor, and he ran around the end of the couch over to Santa Claus, and he leaned over and put his hand on Santa's knee and said, "I need a twain." And that was one of my favorite moments with him. With Amelia, and I got a picture of this, I loved to just sneak around with the camera. She was just, I thought she had the cutest profile I'd ever seen. It was just like a little perfect S-curve, her forehead to her nose. And I would follow her around when she was at the house and take pictures. And she'd gone to her grandmother's room, to her dresser, and had picked up a little hand mirror that was Susan's grandmother's, and she was looking at herself in it. And she had the most pleased look on her face. And I thought, this may well be the last age that she'll look in the mirror and not find flaws, to be that pleased with what she sees in the mirror. And I thought it was just the cutest moment. I got pictures of that, and that's one of my favorite photographs, is that time of her. With Jacob, gracious, they are all more recent, but it's a kind of a tie between, and with all of them, they were such loving children and still are. But favorite thing with Jacob really was taking him fishing. He loves to fish. And I took him last year to a friend's place, and he caught a large brim, about big as my hand, and was bringing the brim in. And all of a sudden it got really hard, and he was calling on me to help him. And my friend was standing there watching, and he's backing up and pulling the fish up closer to the pier. And I look down, and it's about a 5-6 pound bass. And I said, "Gracious, what happened to the brim that was on?" He had a big brim on that I had already seen. And I turned around to get a net, because my friend said, "You're going to need a landing net to get that one in." And then I heard them, as I was getting the net, I heard them shout, and all of a sudden the brim was back on the line. And I looked, and this huge bass was swimming off. He had taken the brim in his mouth, had taken that whole brim, big as my hand, in, and he let go of it and got away. And I grabbed my rod with a devil's horse and flipped it out in front of him. I twitched it a couple of times, and the bass hit it. And I handed that to Jacob and let him reel him in. And it went from my armpit to my fingertip. So it was a big bass. I wish I had a scale to weigh him, but he was really almost as long as my arm. And, had to be big to take a brim that big. But that was a special time, too. I've loved all of those. But those are three little things that just still stand out in my mind.
Yeah, they're, from an outsider's perspective, they all have little things, too, that echo that they're, your grandkids in a way, one way or another. Like I see Ryan's interest in getting into details of things and old technology and learning how things work, and that's something, of course, he gets from his dad as well, but something that I've seen in you is figuring out how things work and how to fix them and all that sort of thing. Amelia loves to draw, artistic creativity, and Jacob is outgoing and gregarious and likes to fish, apparently. So it's neat to see those things kind of echoed down in different ways through my nephews and my niece.
That's interesting.
So moving on from the grandkid discussion a little bit, talked about Ronan, the name Ronan, where that came from, and the episode about him. Really quickly, don't go into a ton of detail, but how did you come up with the names for each of your three children?
Well, with Elizabeth, Susan and I were really close to my mother's sisters. And she had three sisters. And when Elizabeth was born, I just said to Susan, after seeing her go through what she did to bring that baby into the world, I said, whatever we name her, Susan's going to be in there. Just you earn that. You deserve that. The child needs to have your name. So we named her Susan as a first name, and then Elizabeth was my Aunt Mary's middle name. And we liked the way Susan Elizabeth came together. And so she was Susan Elizabeth. But Susan wanted to call her Elizabeth rather than have it the confusion of Susan. And then Melissa really hit two different names. My mother's name was Margaret. And then my Aunt May was Melissa May. And we took the name, she went by May most of the time with us, and we knew her as Aunt May. And so we took the name, her name less used, and put that with that. So it was Margaret Melissa. And we called her Melissa, that went by the middle name as well. And then when you were born, what we had talked about up to that, was if it's a boy or if it's a girl, what are we going to do, with the name. And we had pretty much settled on Ryan Truitt and you would have my initials, and we kind of settled on that. And then one day I was driving home from Fayetteville and thinking about it, and the baby, was getting close to time, and the name Nathaniel just popped in my head out of nowhere. And it was just a real strong feeling associated with it. And I came home that evening. When I got home, I said, Susan, I had an interesting thing happen. I said, I know we had kind of settled on Ryan Truitt, but this name Nathaniel came to me, and she said, "Ooh, I like that." And I said, well, I don't know why that came to me because we were pretty much settled. But she said, well, I really like that. And so I thought, well, it won't be my initials, but she really likes it, and I liked it. It was different. So we went with Nathaniel Truitt, of course. But the little sidebar that was interesting was a lot of people picked on me about when Susan was pregnant the third time. You're trying to get that boy, aren't you? And so forth. And I said, no, this one, we just put it in God's hands. We couldn't decide. I told Susan I didn't have enough sense to know what to ask, hardly, but just that if it was God's will for us to have another child, then it would be a gift. So I had said that ironically a couple of times to other people and to Susan several times, enough that it stuck in Susan's mind. And one day, long after you were born, within a year or two of the time, I guess within a year of the time you were born, she went with a friend to the Baptist bookstore up in Cary and picked up some things. And she came in when I came home that evening, she said, I've got something to show you, and you're not going to believe this. And I said, well, what's that? And she said, I found these bookmarks, and they have the children's names and the Hebrew translation for their names. And she gave me the one for Elizabeth, and I said, well, that kind of fits her, the description on it. And then she did Melissa's, and I said the same thing. And she said, but you're not going to believe this one. And I said, what? And she handed me the bookmark, and I read it, and it said, Nathaniel, gift of God. And I thought that was just so perfect for the way I felt about third child, saying to Susan, let's don't try to have one. Let's don't try not to have one. Let's just put it in God's hands. And if we have a third child, I said, I feel so blessed to even have one because we didn't think we'd be able to have children. And then to have two, I said I'd feel greedy going back to the well. But it was just neat that turned out to be the meaning of your name.
Well, next time Emily and I have a disagreement, I'll remind her that she's speaking to a literal gift from God, and so she should probably listen to my side of the argument.
No, mate, that's funny.
So you've talked about how your respect for mom changed and Certainly, I understand that, seeing the child birthing process and what all that takes. But I'm more interested in hearing about relationship. You relate to your spouse differently as couples than you do when you become parents. So how did having 3 kids, how did that change your relationship with one another?
Well, I think until you have children, I mean, this is just off the cuff here, but when you're married, until children come along, you're still a little bit independent. You kind of take responsibility for yourself and doing what you can kind of do what you want to do as long as you're not infringing on her ability to do what she wants to do, and vice versa. And you have responsibilities you split up on the household things and things like that. But once the children came along, all of a sudden she's like a partner. You become more a team because you have joint responsibility, of this child. And it makes you value each other differently because, as you know already, is a lot of this that to handle it on your own would be really tough. And a lot of it that you don't really want to make the decisions on by yourself. You want somebody equally vested in that responsibility and everything to help you make decisions on things, with their health care and with how you're going to do things like discipline and different things like that. So, without having put a whole lot of forethought into it, that's my first reaction to it. I think it's the first time you feel like you got a partner. And I think the wonderful thing about a partner is that whether it's in your work or whatever, it's someone to share responsibilities. It's someone with as much at stake as you are, so they're protective like you want to be protective, and it's another perspective, and it just kind of rounds things out to make a stronger relationship and make you appreciate each other more.
Well, with me coming along, you had 3 kids. A lot of folks say once you have the third kid, you're outnumbered. I came a good bit after Melissa. She was 6 years older than me. So I'm wondering, did you guys ever feel like outnumbered, or by that point had Melissa and Elizabeth gotten old enough that they were more independent and you didn't feel like you were having to fight for your life there with 3 children and only 2 parents?
No, I can't speak for Susan. When we had 2, they were like 16 months apart. And I joked a lot of times about having to hire somebody to come in twice a day to pull her down off the walls. But I think I even covered it if we talked about that, the fact that they were close enough in age that they were into the same things and kind of entertained each other. And then when you came along, it was sort of like that thing I talked about with grandparents. When you came along, we missed the baby. Your mom, as you know, she's always loved infants. She's always loved little babies and rocking them and cuddling them. And so she was just happy to have another little baby that she could rock. And at that point in time, the girls were more, I think they gravitated more to me because I was more a novelty. They were with Susan during the day, and I'd come home and it was party time because they knew Daddy was going to play and do stuff and tell stories and all like that. And usually, I think the biggest thing is I would get them so amped up they couldn't, go into bed. I'd have to go to bed with them to get them to go to sleep. But, that was all fun too. I remember so many nights laying in the middle of their bed and a head on each shoulder. And then when they went to sleep, trying to figure out how to get up without waking them up because it was time for Magnum P.I. to come on, and I didn't want to miss that. But
great segue, by the way, because we are going to talk about some cultural things from the 1980s. But before we do that, switching to decade mode, 1980s, was that the decade that Mom decided to become an RN?
Well, let's see, on the decision. I know she had talked to me about how early on in high school, her granddaddy was a doctor, and she had been interested in medicine and had wanted to be a nurse. But at that time, nurses were not that well paid, jobs were harder to get, and her parents had encouraged her to go into teaching like her sister had done. And after she had the baby, this one nurse, and I think I talked about this, there was one nurse up there at Durham Regional that worked with the labor and delivery that just meant the world to Susan. And they just bonded. In fact, that nurse came to see Susan in Four Oaks. I know of twice that she came down to see her, and they talked on the phone a lot. But she taught Susan a lot about how to handle the baby and how to bathe them and to do the different things. And she just spent a lot of time with her. She'd stay after her shift and show Susan little tricks. And that had an effect on Susan. She appreciated that nurse so much that I think she wanted to mean that to somebody else, what that woman had meant to her. And that nurse came to see her when she and her husband were moving away. They were moving up north, and she came to see Susan again to tell her, and came to tell her back, because I guess they knew they would never see each other again. But anyway, at that time, Susan was staying home with the children, following that after Melissa was born. And she said that she wanted to go back to school at night and get her nursing degree. So she did that. She went back to school, got her nursing degree, got her LPN, and then kept going and got her RN. And then she was able to work her schedule out. She worked to start with down at the doctor's office, which when the children were in school, that worked out real well because she got off at like 3 or 3:30, and Granddaddy would pick the kids up from preschool or school and keep them till she got home.
So looking at the decade of the 1980s, you already mentioned Magnum PI. Are there any other 80s is I feel like decades now are not as distinct. You look at the 60s to the 70s and the 70s to the 80s, and you've got majorly different fashion and majorly different types of media. The music sounded so different. But then you look at like 2000 to 2010, 2010 to 2020s, there are shifts, and probably the further away we get, we'll be able to see these decade differences. But the 80s are just a very iconic decade for the fashion, the music, the iconic films that came out in the 1980s, and the TV shows. Mm-hmm. Culturally, what do you, and you were in your 30s in that decade, what do you remember from that decade that were favorites of yours in any of those categories? Movies, TVs, music, fashion, any of it?
I mentioned the Magnum PI. That was one of my favorite shows. I loved the music from it. And I just loved his character, that I guess I related to his character, not from being 6'3" and good looking, but from just, he wasn't Mr. Perfect. He got in trouble. Things didn't always go the way he wanted it to go, but he always tried to do the right thing, and usually ended up coming out that things worked out, but it wasn't necessarily smooth. And I think I related to it because that was kind of the way my life was, that I succeeded sometimes in spite of everything. And his character was just a believable, likable, every guy's character. And Tom Selleck has carried that into a lot of his roles of being just kind of humble. And, he's never been a cocky character in any of the things, even as in Blue Bloods. He's at the top of his game, but he's still not cocky about it, arrogant. But I enjoyed that. That decade introduced him, and he's always been one of my favorites. Music was great because we had, well, you remember making that, what do you call it?
Playlist?
Playlist for me for my birthday when I hit 70. That featured a lot of the groups that I loved, probably the most.
That was more Melissa, maybe Elizabeth. I don't recall, but they were more cognizant of the 80s than I was because they were older than me.
Yeah, and they listened. I think a lot of it came from being in the car with me and the cassettes that I played. That was prior to DVDs or
maybe we'll
Bluetooth.
find that playlist and link to it somewhere. So if you want to listen to the Ron 80s playlist, you can find it.
Yeah,
I seem to remember you liking the show Cheers. Was that something that you came in?
Yes. That's one definitely. That's one I loved. In fact, years later, as you recall, when we went to Boston, I found the place where the exterior of the show was filmed in the bottom of this hotel down in the basement, and went there and came home with a Cheers hat and T-shirt and everything. But that was one of my favorite shows for it, and I still enjoyed going back and looking at reruns of it. It's launched a lot of careers too. That show did.
Right.
From Ted Danson to, gracious, I can't think of her name now, Allie. There were a lot of people that came out and had offshoots from that.
Any 80s movies? My favorite movies, Star Wars and Indiana Jones. A lot of those were out in the 80s, but there were a lot of other classic movies, Terminator,
Wasn't Jaws in there too?
Jaws, I think, in the 70s. There may have been some 80s follow-ups to Jaws that came out back then.
But as you know, probably my favorite was the Indiana Jones, the first one of those that came out, and coming back up to date here. It was interesting. When I saw the movie, I was just taken in by the movie. I just loved it. I loved the period that it was in, and just the cars and just that's a fascinating period of time. But I also loved, I was, into my career, and I had always wanted to be an illustrator. And one of the illustrators I admired was an illustrator named Amsel. He never signed his first name, but I loved his style. And when I saw the movie, they had small posters in the lobby in little display cases. And I knew one of the people there at the theater where I saw it. And I talked him into letting me have one of those posters. When the movie ran out, he said he would hold it for me. And I got that poster and very carefully rolled it up and put it in a cardboard tube and set it back, thinking one day I'm going to frame this. But you know how it is, life gets in the way and you don't do what you think you're going to do with the things a lot of times. But you also know me, I didn't throw anything away because I hadn't done anything with it in 10 years. So one day, years later, you saw the movie and really loved the movie. And when I saw how much you were enjoying it, it triggered my memory that I had gotten that poster. So I don't know how old you were. Do you recall when I gave you that poster?
It would have been sometime in high school. I know that I got really into Indiana Jones in like my sophomore year of high school. That's when I asked for the jacket for Christmas. Mm-hmm. So maybe it was my junior year, follow up to that, but probably sometime in high school, and you got it framed for me.
Yeah.
And that poster is really unusual size. I told you I looked it up, and there's no record of that. It's not a standard size poster. So when I posted it online in a kind of a movie poster aficionado group, they were like, well, I hate to break it to you, this is not an original poster from a theater. And it's because the size doesn't match original posters. But then there was that poster faded because it was in direct sunlight for so many years. And I always wanted to get a reprint or something to put over the top of it, and couldn't find it because it was that very unusual size. And just last month, I'm on Facebook Marketplace, and it populates this Raiders of the Lost Ark poster from the estate of a North Carolina collector and it looks exactly like another Telltale. Is not just the size, but there's a thing that at the top that says from the creator of Jaws and Star Wars come a new hero or something like that. And it's, instead of being on 2 lines, it's on 1 line on this very unusual poster. And I was like, oh, that's exactly like the one Dad had. So I messaged a guy, and long story short, ended up getting it. And he tells me, like, I can't vouch for it 100%, but this guy had a lot of high-end items that he had collected. And the story was that this was an original poster. So brought it back, put it side by side with my poster, and it looks identical, only not faded. And so that'll be fun. I think I'm going to see if I can get it scanned in a really nice high quality and have a reprint done to display, and then keep that one sealed away somewhere. But the fact that you found one in a theater, and then there's another collector here in North Carolina, maybe it was like a regional limited run that was just in an unusual size, but it's a very cool size. I wish movie posters were in that size more often, because it doesn't take up your whole wall.
Yeah.
But it's still just a really good artwork.
That's what appealed to me. It was, 18 by 24 or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. So, and another fun fact, bringing it all full circle, I think I've told you this before, but for our listeners, if you're unaware, before Harrison Ford signed on to do Raiders of the Lost Ark, they had all but signed Tom Selleck to be Indiana Jones. And he had already signed a contract with CBS or whatever TV station it was to do Magnum PI. So he couldn't take it, and they had to punt. And they had, of course, George Lucas had just done Star Wars, and Han Solo. Harrison Ford had been very popular in that. So because Tom Selleck couldn't take it, Harrison Ford got that opportunity, and now, of course, couldn't imagine anybody else in that role. But pretty cool that your favorite TV guy almost took that movie spot as well.
Yeah, that is.
Very similar sort of type of character that they play, I guess. Well, that pretty much is going to wrap everything up for this episode. One more question for you, and it's a doozy. I apologize. But if you could go back to January of 1980 right now, so Elizabeth is a couple years old, a year old and some change. Melissa is 3 months away from being born. And you had a time machine you could warp back, but it only lasted. There's only enough energy in the time machine to keep you in the past for 60 seconds. You can go see yourself for 60 seconds. What would you tell yourself as advice? I mean, obviously you can't say like buy Bitcoin or whatever. Like just for the decade of the 80s, what would you say to Ron of the past that he needs to do in the 10 years ahead?
Wow. I don't know that I would change a whole lot. I want to say don't spend so much time at work, spend it with your kids. But it was important to spend time at work in order to be able to have things like Susan being home with the kids. And, it's really hard to say, but I would just say, soak it up, just the good and the bad. And I know that's hard with you right now to see, because it's nothing more frustrating than a crying baby, because you feel like you got to fix it. And sometimes there just ain't no fixing. It's just what it's going to do. But, to soak it up, I would tell Ron, write a journal, like what I told you.
And then right after that, you would tell him to put all of his life savings into Apple computer stock.
Yeah, it would have been nice to have some foresight on things like that. But overall, I have really, those were just great times. It was family centered, and, life was, and the things that y'all were doing. And there was just it was a great time, and I'm thankful for it.
Well, that's a good good summary of your 30s and the 1980s. And next week we'll be traveling to the 1990s, which was a decade of many changes, and some of them hard, but all of them ultimately good. We'll talk about those in more detail. Yeah. But thanks for your time today, and we will have that episode coming out hopefully this coming Sunday still. But thank you again, everyone, for giving us some grace on the timing of these episodes and getting these last few out. All right,
I didn't mention my favorite car from the 80s, but I was fortunate to have that.
Go ahead. What's your favorite car?
1984 Supra, Toyota Supra.
And maybe it will rise once more from the ashes.
Yeah.
We'll see.
We're working on it.
All right, have a great week, everybody.